Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and this is part 3 of our look at illustrating monopoly versus perfect competition with a focus on the differences in price and quantity in that comparison. And we can also discuss allocative efficiency and productive efficiency between the two market structures. In the first video of this series, we illustrated the industry for perfect competition in graph A, the perfectly competitive firm in graph B, and the monopolist. And students were wondering, do they need to graph all three of these models side by side? And that's not the case. That first video was just to illustrate the three put together. And in the second video, we looked at the industry and the monopoly, and we had those two side by side and looking at the differences in price and quantity as well as allocative efficiency. And in this particular video, we're going to look at the individual firm graphed next to a monopolist, and again, looking at differences in quantity of output, price, and so on. Okay, so let's go ahead and illustrate this from scratch. So I'll take a moment to just erase these three models, and then I will show you on an exam how you would draw this with just the firm and the monopolist side by side. Okay, so we're almost done here, and let's start from scratch with these three models, or with two of these three models side by side. Okay, so first we're going to illustrate the perfectly competitive firm next to the monopolist. Okay, so this will be graph A. So we're going to illustrate our y-axes, and I'll just go ahead and draw this all the way across since I'm going to draw the monopolist as well. Okay, just going to erase a bit over here so we can separate the two. And let's go ahead and label our axes. So over here, for both models, we'll be measuring price, costs, and revenue. And again, for the monopolist, we're also measuring price, costs, and revenue. On the x-axis, we're measuring the quantity of output. Okay, and let's label the two. So we're going to have graph A. This will be the individual firm in perfect competition. And in graph B, we'll be measuring or illustrating the monopoly. Oh, and I forgot to label that this is graph A. Graph A is the individual firm. Okay. Now the first thing I'm going to do is illustrate the perfectly elastic price that's established by the industry that the firm must accept. That'll be the first thing I'll illustrate. So here's that perfectly elastic price. And I'm going to label this price for the perfectly competitive firm, accepting that perfectly elastic price from the industry. And over here, again, I can illustrate that this is the price for the perfectly competitive firm, which is equal to the average revenue for the perfectly competitive firm, which is equal to the demand curve for the perfectly competitive firm, which is equal to, demand is also equal to the marginal benefit for the perfectly competitive firm, which is also equal to the marginal revenue for the perfectly competitive firm. All right, they are all equal: price equal to average revenue equal to demand equal to marginal benefit equal to marginal revenue. So let's illustrate the supply curve for perfect competition. And as a result of the law of diminishing marginal returns, it has this backwards J shape, and that'll be labeled S1 equal to the marginal costs of production for the individual firm. And you can also go ahead and illustrate the supply curve for the monopolist, which also has that backwards J shape due to the law of diminishing marginal returns. And this will be S2 for the monopolist equal to the marginal cost 2. So I can distinguish between these two curves. And for perfect competition, I'm going to go ahead and illustrate that it's operating at normal profit. So this will be my ATC curve, my average total cost curve. Average total cost curve number 1. And I'm going to also label here that this is the price for the perfectly competitive firm coming all the way across. Okay. Now, let's illustrate where the perfectly competitive firm will produce. We're going to assume profit maximization, that the objective of the firm is to maximize profit. And the rule for profit maximization, which you absolutely need to know, is producing where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. That's where the profit is at its highest point. And so for the firm, we see that here is our marginal cost curve, and it's intersecting with the perfectly elastic marginal revenue curve at this point. So I'm going to label this point A. And that will determine output right here. All right, and we'll say that that is quantity for the perfectly competitive firm. For the individual firm, this will be the amount of output they'll be producing to maximize their profit. Now let's go ahead and start illustrating the monopolist. And I'm going to have the demand curve being relatively inelastic. Inelastic because there's no close substitutes. That gives the monopolist its market power. This will be demand. Here we're going to say this is the demand for the monopolist. I'll call this maybe D2, I guess. D2 equal to the marginal benefit 2. And since we're assuming that the firm is not price discriminating, the marginal revenue curve is going to separate from the average revenue curve. And actually, let's go ahead and remember that demand is equal to marginal benefit, also equal to the average revenue. And here is the marginal revenue curve that separates from. So we're going to label that MR2. So it's distinguished from this marginal revenue curve. And since we're going to go ahead and compare productive and allocative efficiency, I'm also going to illustrate the average total cost curve. So let's use this color. And I'm going to have ATC perhaps come down to this point. And that'll be my ATC curve. Average total costs for the monopolist. I'll call it ATC2 just to distinguish it from the individual firm. So the monopolist is going to seek to profit maximize where the marginal revenue curve intersects the marginal cost curve. So S2 or MC2 intersects with MR2 at this point. And that will determine the level of output. Let's see if we can choose another color. So the level of output would be right here. So that's the quantity for the monopolist. And the monopolist will stop producing at QM, quantity of monopolist, and then price according to their demand curve. So here we have the price of the monopolist being significantly greater than the perfectly competitive firm at price PC. Right here also we can highlight the level of cost to illustrate the supernormal profit, but that's not the point of this um, question. Comparing monopoly with perfect competition with a focus on price and quantity. So I don't really need to focus on illustrating the supernormal profit. One other thing. Let's illustrate one more thing. So the industry for perfect competition is where supply equals demand. And so in video 2 of this series and in video 1 of this series, we were highlighting that at this particular point, all right, this is point A, I'm going to call this point B. This is where the industry for perfect competition would be producing. So let's go ahead and label that point as well, so we can compare the quantity of the monopolists versus the quantity of perfect competition. So here I have point B. I'll go ahead and label this point C, and this particular point, point D. And I'm going to highlight in yellow the welfare loss, the underallocation that's generated by the monopolist, which is between areas C, B, and D. Okay, there. So I'm basically done. I've drawn the individual firm, I've drawn the monopolist, and I've highlighted the differences in price and the differences in quantity, and also highlighted the impact on allocative efficiency. So let's go ahead and analyze this. So graph A illustrates the individual firm of perfect competition, and graph B illustrates the individual monopoly. We're measuring on both models, price, cost, revenue on the y-axis and the quantity of output on the x-axis. For the individual firm, we have a perfectly elastic price that's established by the industry for the perfectly competitive market structure. That price is price for perfect competition, price PC. And price PC is equal to the average revenue, which is equal to the demand curve, equal to the marginal benefit, equal to the marginal revenue curve in perfect competition. For the individual firm, we have the upward sloping marginal cost curve, which is our supply curve. And we also have the average total cost curve that intersects with the supply curve when ATC is at minimum. And minimum ATC signals productive efficiency. So productive efficiency is achieved when a firm produces at minimum average total cost. Assuming the objective of profit maximization, the individual firm will produce where MR equals MC at point A, setting output at quantity PC. Okay. Now moving on to the monopolist, we have the upward sloping supply curve, S2 equals to the marginal cost curve. It intersects with the average total cost curve at its lowest point. We have a downward sloping demand curve labeled D2, which is relatively inelastic because there's no close substitutes. The monopolist offering some type of unique good equal to the marginal benefit equal to the average revenue. And we have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that's less than the average revenue curve as a result of the firm not price discriminating. The monopolist will produce where MR equals MC, which is at point C, that it will establish quantity of output at QM, and the monopolist will price according to the demand curve, which is at point D, or price of PM. All right. Good. So there's a brief analysis. And now we can focus on highlighting the differences in price and quantity. So clearly we can see that the monopolist charges a higher price at PM than the individual firm that charges a price at perfect competition. Since the firm is a price taker, it's established by the industry, so they don't actually set the price. But clearly the monopolist charges more, a higher price than the perfectly competitive firm, which is a disadvantage of the monopoly. In addition, we can see that the monopolist produces less than the quantity in perfect competition set by the industry, where QM is less than QPC. So again, the price of the monopolist is greater than the price established in perfect competition, and the quantity of output in by the monopolist is less than the quantity of output by the industry in perfect competition. In addition, we can highlight that the monopolist under allocates. Since it produces at QM, we can see that the marginal benefit at point D is greater than the marginal cost at point C. So at QM, MB is greater than MC, which signals that the monopolist is under allocating resources, which creates a welfare loss, which is the shaded area between points B, C, and D. In the case of the individual firm produces where MB equals MC. Here we have the MC curve, and it's intersecting at this point, which is our marginal benefit curve. So the firm is allocatively efficient. In addition, another advantage of the firm is that it's productively efficient. In the long run, when it's producing at normal profit at minimum ATC, it meets the condition of productive efficiency. Whereas for the monopolist, when it produces at QM, the average total cost is greater than minimum. So the monopolist is productively inefficient, which makes sense because it doesn't face competition. It's not really concerned with keeping costs at minimum. There's no incentive to do so since they don't face competition. All right, so that's it. Hopefully this was helpful in comparing these two market structures, highlighting advantages and disadvantages in terms of price, quantity, productive, allocative efficiency. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.